a thanks to the Friends of the Westwood Library for supporting this program. And there are calendars in the back that list all of the programs for the month of March. There's a list of the Friends book sale.
We just wanted to let you know we're having a free concert this Saturday, Women in World Jazz at 2 o'clock here in this room. It's going to be a diverse group of music educators, and it should be really, really interesting. But I know it's going to snow, but.
Hi, my name is Susie Canali. I work in the children's department.
My name is Claire Connors. I've worked for the library for 14 years. I work at the branch and I work here on Monday night.
Hi, I'm Tracy Carrigan and I work at the reference desk upstairs.
I'm Tina McCusker. I'm a history teacher, but I work upstairs one night a week in reference.
My name is Caroline Ty. I work at the circulation desk and sometimes upstairs at the reference desk.
And sometimes at children's.
And sometimes at children's.
And sometimes at the branch.
So I guess I'm up first. My first book is called The War That Saved My Life. And I was a little reluctant to read this book. I only kind of jumped on the bandwagon when I saw everybody was reading it and everybody was loving it. I'm not typically a historical fiction buff, but if there's one book that I would pick for anybody who was a little bit reluctant to jump into this genre, it would be this story. It's wonderfully written and told. It's about a 10-year-old girl named Ada, who is living in the midst of World War II. And she lives with her brother and her mother, who is on the verge of being, she's terrible to the children. But the town is told to have all the children released and to go to safety in fear of bombs. So her brother is sent on a train, and the little girl is kept behind because she has a foot that is disabled, and her mother is very embarrassed about her, and she thinks that she has no value to be saved. So instead she escapes, and she gets onto the train with her brother, and she finds herself luckily in the hands of a woman named Susan Smith. And Susan Smith describes herself as a woman who is not caring, who has very little to give, although she ends up taking care of these children and giving them a whole new hope and a whole new other understanding of their value, particularly of Ada, who learns how to ride horses, how to stand up for herself, and how to read. So the interesting part about this book is that in the end, they're faced with the decision of particularly maybe returning home or not. And how I felt about this, which is sometimes even more important than what the story is about, is that I felt a tremendous sense of justice being served. And we don't always get that from reading a book. So if you are interested in picking up a historical fiction novel that is fast-paced and gives you a sense of value and justice in the end, I highly recommend The War That Saved My Life.
My first book is Two Steps Forward by Graham Simpson. He also wrote the Rosie Project and the Rosie Effect. I don't know if any of you've heard those. This is about the Camino, the walk from France to Spain, and it's about a woman who recently lost her husband and a man who's recently gone through a messy divorce, and they meet before and kind of meet along the walk. I didn't know anything about the Camino, and I don't know that I'd want to walk it, but being part of it, but it's a nice book.
Okay, so my first book is Caucasia by Dancy Siena, and in this book the author wants to highlight the racial tension in Boston in the late 70s and early 80s. So to do this, she used a biracial couple, Dirk and Sandy, and they have two daughters, Cole and Birdie. Cole is black like her father, and Sandy is light-skinned like her mother. So it's not a very happy marriage, and they, are often fighting, arguing, and the children feel the tension. So the girls are very close when they're growing up, and Cole actually invents a secret language, Elemento, which is their special bond. Eventually, the parents do split up, and the father goes to Brazil with his new black girlfriend, and and Birdie stays with her mother. I should have said earlier, they were involved in the civil rights movement, the parents. So when the parents split up, Sandy thinks that the FBI are after her because of her political affiliations, so she goes on the run. And they go from place to place for 4 years, but finally she decides that they need to settle down, and they start to live in New Hampshire. Birdie has never really been happy, and she's always wanted to go and look for her father and her sister. So she leaves and she goes back to Boston, and she meets with somebody that she was in school with earlier, and finds out from him that actually her father came back to the States 2 years. He only stayed 2 years in Brazil, and that he's now living in California. So she goes and finds them, and she finds that Cole is no longer living with her father, and her father says, I was disappointed. Cole was never really the black daughter that I wanted to have. So the sisters are reunited, and it transpires like when both the sisters still love both their parents, and both the parents love them. There's just one scene in the book that really highlights the whole thing of the racial tension in the black versus white. So they were going to go, Derek and his two daughters were going to go to a trip to the public gardens, but Cole was sick, so he went alone with Birdie. And they were in the public garden, and he was sitting reading the newspaper, and Birdie was leaning against him. And there was this couple, and they were looking at them, very, very whatever, peculiarly, and eventually they went out and they got policemen. So the 2 policemen came over, and they said to Derek, what's up? What's with this little girl? Who is this? And Derek said, this is my daughter, Birdie. And the police wouldn't believe him. And he took out photographs of his 2 daughters, and also his card showing that he was a professor. And then they pulled the Birdie aside and they said to her, it's okay, you're safe now. You don't have to be afraid anymore. What did this man do to you? Who is this? And Birdie said, this is my father. And eventually, after some more time, they just leave, and the couple are still there looking at them. And as they go back to the car, Birdie can sense that her father is really angry, and she's just confused and afraid and upset by the whole thing. And this kind of really, highlights the whole black versus white issue, and the way the racial tension was at that time in Boston.
So my first book is called One Summer America, 1927. So this book is from 2013. I'm always looking for history books. I'm looking for ones that make history digestible for my students. So I think this book does, because it tells stories that happened in 1927 in little vignettes, so you don't have to sit and read the whole thing all through. You can read month by month. It talks about natural disasters, it talks about presidential mistresses, it talks about school bombings. All these things happened in 1927, who knew? One of the fascinating things has to do with Prohibition, and there's one little section I want to read to you from this book about Prohibition. And we all know that Prohibition happened, but this little vignette will give you a sample of what's in the book. Sometime on the night of June 23rd, 1927, Wilson B. Hickox, age 43, a wealthy businessman from Cleveland, Ohio, returned from an evening out in New York City and poured himself a nightcap in his room at the Roosevelt Hotel. Shortly thereafter, Hickox began to feel some peculiar and unpleasant sensations, a tightening of the throat and chest, a kind of bitter pain spreading through his body. One by one, his body systems were collapsing into paralysis as the toxic effects of strychnine swept through him. What was most notable about Hickox's death was not that he had been poisoned, but that it was his own government who had killed him. So then it goes on to explain how during Prohibition, because there was so much bootlegging, the government was poisoning all the alcohol so that people would realize, I could drink this, but there's a chance that there might be poison in this bottle. You don't know. There was no way to tell. So that's one of the little stories that might make history more interesting.
I'm gonna do for my first book, The Last Day of Emily Lindsay by Nick Joseph. And it's kind of a thriller. It's really two stories, and one is all these small children who live in this cult who have decided that they want to break into the room where the adults go and find out what's happening. And their parents are the true believers, but they don't really understand what's going on or why they live there. And the other story is Emily Lindsay, who has been found on her couch, covered in blood, holding a knife. The blood's not her own. And it goes back and forth and how they're tied together. But it's kind of a interesting thriller.
As a staff member and a patron of this library, I started out going to sections of the library that I thought were appropriate for me. So I hung out in the murder mystery section with the Jessica Fletchers. I love those books. And then I realized that there's a whole lot of books in different sections of the library, particularly when I started working in children's. So my second book tonight is called Property of the Rebel Librarian. And sometimes you just need a feel-good read, and this is it. This is a very timely book, though, about a girl named June Harper. She's 12 years old and in the 7th grade, and she is an avid reader. And one day, her parents catch her with a book called The Makings of the Witch and decide that it should be abolished. It is inappropriate for their daughter. So they go to the school and they complain to the school that they have several books in their library that should be destroyed, taken out. They weren't appropriate for the kids. So here comes this whole huge rebellion by parents, stripping the library and then firing the librarian, Miss Bradshaw, who is godlike to most of the children of Dogwood Middle School. Well, to June Harper, she's not going to take this lying down. She tries to figure out a solution on how to get her hands on books, and one day, there's a little free public library that pops up on the side of the street with all of her favorite books filled inside. And she starts bringing them and smuggling them into school and reading them with the lights out in her room. And she decides, well, maybe I can take this one step farther. So she finds an abandoned locker. And she opens up her own library in the school. So June Harper wasn't exactly the most popular girl in school, but guess what happens when she starts the little rebellion against the school taking away the books? June becomes the all-star of Dogwood Middle School. And the neat thing about this is that you see a story that allows children to believe that they can take control and change the world with pure determination. And scarily enough, this is still going on in many parts of the world. So it's very timely, it's a lot of fun, and it makes you feel good at the end of the story.
So my next book is Calling Me Home by Julie Kibler. Has anyone read this book? I felt it was as good as The Help, but it surprised me that it didn't get the it's like no one's heard of it, but it's a story of a woman who's 89, and she asks her hairdresser, who's black, to drive her to a funeral from Texas to Cincinnati. Won't tell her why, but along the journey she tells her bits and pieces of her life, and when she was in her teens or early 20s, she fell in love with a would-be black doctor. And it follows their life. It's a nice story. And I think that if it had the publicity that The Help had, it probably would have, that one. It's a great book.
Okay. So my second book is called Sunrays Garden, and by Gail Tsuchikama. In it you get a bit of history about the Japanese invading China, and you get a nice kind of picture of the Japanese countryside and how peaceful it was when Stephen Cole, who was a 20-year-old student, Chinese student in Hong Kong, and he was sent by his father to their summer house in Japan in a small village called Terumi. So while he's there, while he's getting better, he enjoys the countryside, he enjoys swimming and painting and getting to know about the Japanese culture and Japanese culture and customs. So while he's there, he gets to know Matsu. He is the caretaker for the house and the gardens. And as they develop a friendship, Matsu takes him to a place where there's a leper colony. And there he meets Sashi. And he sees immediately, you know, Matsu's devotion to Sashi and what special friendship they have. And the three of them form a very special bond. So while he's in Japan, Stephen meets his first girlfriend. But her father obviously doesn't like him because she's Chinese. And eventually, when her brother is killed, the relationship breaks up. In the book, there are two gardens. There's Matthew's garden at the house, which is a big, elaborate garden. It has ponds and wells and a lot of beautiful flowering shrubs and flowers. And then there is Sashi's garden, which is the complete opposite. It's a very sparse, bare garden, and it's composed of stones that are made, small stones that are made to look like ripples of a wave. And in the middle there's one single flower. And Sashi explains that she loves raking these stones to form different images. So Matsu's garden is destroyed by a storm and it is completely devastated. And this is supposed to show the way he views that Sashi's life has been devastated by leprosy. And while Stephen is really enjoying his nice, calm life while he is there, he knows that eventually he's going to have to go home. And there are kind of two issues for him. One, he's worried about his parents because the Japanese are advancing on Hong Kong. And also he doesn't like going home because he knows that their parents' marriage is about to break down. And even though it's very hard for him to leave his friends and to leave Japan, at the end of the book we see him getting on a train on his first leg of his journey home.
My second book is also a history book, and similar. I picked it up because it had the same thing, a number, and it's 1947, where it now begins. This is a new book. It was published in 2016. It's by a Swedish writer, but it was just published in the United States in 2018. So in this book, the writer, Elizabeth Osbrink, does it month by month, just like the 1927 book. However, she moves from city to city throughout the book. And she weaves different threads: women, the far right, the Middle East, Islam. And they're all separate each month in each geographical location. But as you move through the book, they come together. So I'll just give you, again, read a couple of parts from January, for instance, and then you'll see how they come together. And these are like the types of vignettes. January, London. It is announced on January 7th that 500 women employed by London Transport have to vacate their posts. They're being sent home. In the months to come, all London's buses and tram conductresses will be dismissed. 10,000 of them altogether. The men are back. January, Rome. Just a few days before 1946 gives way to 1947, 5 men gather on the Via Regina Elena in Rome. A journalist, an archaeologist, an auditor, a trade union leader, and a man claiming to be Mussolini's illegitimate son. Together they found the Movimento Sociale Italiano, a movement based on the ideals and ideas as Mussolini's fascist party had. It rapidly attracts numerous supporters and large amounts of money through private donations. Only a month or so later, local sections are set up all over Italy, and the movement begins, attacking communism and democracy, but not just in Italy, all over Europe. Then, Ismailia, February, that's in the Middle East. Listing what Han Albana loathes is simple: sexual license, women's emancipation, democracy, music, dance, singing, foreign influences. At an early age, it became Alvana's aim to prescribe what was right and to proscribe what was wrong. As an adolescent in the town of Amalia, he and some of his friends formed a group whose mission was to improve morality through prayer. At 20, he lived in a house in the city. The rooms on the ground floor were rented by Jews. There were Christians on the first floor, and he and some friends rented the rooms on the top floor, a metaphor for the development of the monotheistic religions. After this, he founded the Muslim Brotherhood. And then London in February. Tuesday, February 18th, Great Britain relinquishes responsibility for Palestine. Thursday, February 20th, they announced that Britain will be granting India independence. On February 21st, Britain will no longer support Greece and Turkey. So that is the kind of thing. It's just a date, a place, and then a sentence, statement, or a few sentences. But it is 1947 where it now begins, because when they all come together, it's all about what's happening today.
My next book is How to Start a Fire by Lisa Lutz. And this is a book about three friends, three women who meet in college, become like best friends. And something happens one night, that they have this one terrible night where something awful happens, and that like changes like each of their lives in different ways. And the same story is told over and over again from each of their different perspectives. And you never really understand what happened that night till the end of the book, because everybody sees it so differently. Everybody blames themselves, they blame each other, and it's really interesting how like one event can be understood in so many ways. But you know, it's the story of like friends who like stick together and work through it. But it was actually, it sounds awful, but it's a really nice story. Something terrible happens, but it's a really nice story of like friends who stick together and stick it out.
So one day I wandered out of the children's department, and I actually headed upstairs to the adult section. And I'm not knocking it, because they've got some great stuff out there. And this was one of them. It's called The Death of Mrs Westaway by Ruth Ware. Does anybody like Agatha Christie in here? Anybody? Okay, I was a big Agatha Christie fan, and I was really pleasantly surprised because this book is kind of written in her sort of style. The rolling out of the story is, I found to be very similar. So this is an interesting story about a woman named Hal, and Hal has had it rough. Her mother passes away at when she's just about to turn 18. She's tragically hit by a car outside, and her mother was a tarot card reader. So Hal has to drop out of school and take over her mother's craft ship to be able to continue to take care of herself on her own. She lives in a flat. This takes place in England, and she's barely making it by, but then she gets in a little trouble. She owes a ton of money to a loan shark. She has a ton of stack of bills, and she just does not know what to do. She can't make her ends meet. But lo and behold, one day, a mysterious letter shows up in the mail saying that she is the recipient of a massive inheritance. But here's the catch. The inheritance comes from a woman named Mrs. Westaway. But the problem is Hal's grandmother already died. She is not the long-lost daughter that she believes they are looking for. But what's a girl to do when you gotta make ends meet? She figures that she can play these people better because she's learned how to read people through doing tarot card reading. So she says, what the heck, I'll try. So she goes down to Penzance and she meets with this family. And it isn't the kind of inheritance that she was expecting. She finds that she is going to inherit a massive piece of property while the grandmother has eliminated all of her children. So she's not exactly the fan that shows up to the party in this situation. She figures maybe it's time to come clean and tell them that she's really not the daughter, except she starts stumbling on clues that are starting to give her questions in her head. She's also starting to find really strange things about this family, like scratch marks in the bedroom that they've kept her in, and then siblings are starting to act a little strange, like they might be covering something up. So she decides it's not always about the people who are sitting in front of you, it's about how the cards are laid down, how she can read them. So if you like a good mystery and a fun little twist that uses tarot card reading as your strength and your tool, you're gonna like this book.
So, my next book is Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. It takes place in North Carolina. Young girl, 7-year-old, her mother's abused and leaves. Then her older brother and sister leave. Then her brother that's closer to her in age leave, and she's left with the father trying to take care of her, make ends meet. Tough life, but a murder takes place as she gets a little older. The father ends up leaving too, so she's left totally alone. She tries to go to school, and they make fun of her at school. She goes one day. The truant officer tries to find her. She learns how to hide really well. Later in the book, a murder happens, and it goes back and forth from when she was little to an adult. But it's beautiful. The wildlife there, the flowers, the way she writes is just, I think it's her first book, but it's a nice story. Doesn't sound very nice with being left, but it is.
Okay, so my next book is called The God of Small Things by Roy Arundachi. Okay, so it's set around 1969 in the South Indian state of Kerala, and the story opens with Sophie Mall drowning in the river. She's the English cousin of the two children who are the main characters in the book. They're 7-year-old twins, Rachel and Esther. And at this time, Rachel and Esther are living in their maternal grandmother's home. Their mother has taken them back there when her husband started to beat her and the children. And many years later, 31 years later, Rachel comes back to Ayman House, which at the time when the children were small was a really elegant house, and it was a really prosperous family. But when she comes back all this time later, we can see how the family had declined, how the house had declined. The windows are dirty, the brass doorknobs are dirty, and the only sign of life in the house is the new television set of great aunt, I can't pronounce them all, Kochimama, where she sits every day watching the television with her servant. But it's not to see her great aunt that Rachel came back, but she has heard that Esther has come back. So once Rachel and Esther were inseparable as children growing up, and now they've been separated for 25 years. So the story goes back and forth from the past to the present, and we get a picture of what life was like when they were growing up in the house. There is a picture of the Syrian priests swinging their censers and the dancers dancing in the temple. Communism is starting to decline, and the untouchables has become a political issue. So Esther and Rachel are used to putting up with the adults in their life. There are many adults coming in and out of their life. There is Mamachi, the grandmother, and the scar is still on her head where her husband beat her, and she keeps a bottle of Christian Dior perfume locked up in the safe. Then there's baby Kochimama, who wanted to become a nun, not so much because of her religion, but because of her affection for Father Mulligan, but she only lasted a year in the convent. Coach Maria is a house servant, and she thinks that Rachel is making fun of her when she tells her that Armstrong has walked on the moon. So, and finally, the most flamboyant character is Uncle Chaco, and he's the father of Sophie Mall, who has returned from England after a broken marriage. And he's an Oxford educated Marxist, and he has taken over the grandmother's canning business, but he's just running it into the ground. He had great intentions of setting up a union for the workers, but he just never got around to it. He spends his time philosophizing and flirting with the female workers. So Veluta, an untouchable, who's a family carpenter, is really the only competent one out of the whole lot of them. He fixes everything around the house, from the canning machine, machinery to the fountain in baby Camacha's garden. He's both essential and taken for granted in the life of the twins. Like breathing, he is the god of small things. So he really is kind of the foundation of the whole thing and kind of keeps everything together.
This book is called The Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels by John Meacham. So John Meacham is a writer, a historian at Vanderbilt, and he spoke at George Bush's funeral. He did one of the eulogies. And so when I saw that we had the book at the library, I thought his eulogy was so beautiful, I decided I wanted to read his book. And it is similar to this in that each chapter is about a different time, a different president. So again, you don't have to sit and read it cover to cover, and it's digestible that way. And the title comes from a speech from Abraham Lincoln, and he says, "We are not enemies but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." So he talks about politicians, presidents, especially, that had to deal with different groups that were not getting along, similar to our current political situation. And he talks about how people are able to rise above in difficult times and make it work. So it's actually, you feel hopeful by the time you finish reading the book.
I'm never going out drinking again. My next book is called The Good Demon.
The Good
The Good Demon. It starts off with an exorcism.
Maybe that's what we need.
And it's just kind of a fun read, but it's a teenage girl, and she has a difficult home life, and she's kind of lonely, so when they take her demon out of her, she's furious, though, to her best friend. She was never alone. She always had someone to talk to. And it's kind of a weird little religious town, so the demon thought this might happen and has told her stories and left some clues, and the book is about her trying to become repossessed. So it's very different, but it's fun.
Don't fall down. Another, in my opinion, if you really want to find something juicy too, you should wander up to the YA department in the teen room because they've got all the good stuff. This is straight out of there. And this is a romance book. I had to throw in one of those. It's called Things I Should Have Known. And it's a very sweet story about a girl named Chloe who on the outside seems she has everything going for her. She's 17, she's beautiful, blonde hair, blue eyes. She's dating this really gorgeous guy who's on the soccer team. And she looks like everybody would want to be her. But in reality at home, her home life is a little tricky. Her father passed away from cancer a few years ago, and her mother has remarried another man who Chloe just really detests. She can't stand him. And the mother's kind of ignoring her, and her other sister, whose name is Ivy. And Ivy's a little bit older, and she's also autistic. So Chloe's starting to look at her sister Ivy and notice that she's a little lonely. And how can she maybe help her make new friends, or particularly a boyfriend? So Chloe makes it her mission to find the right man for her sister, and she finds this really sweet guy in her class that would be a perfect pair. So in order to do this, she's got to team up with the other boy's brother, who just so happens to be in her class, who just so happens is not her favorite person in the world. But through this whole planning stage and this whole strategy to set these kids up, Chloe and David, who is the older brother, end up realizing that they have so much in common about what it's like to have a sibling with special needs who is autistic. And they start to fall in love. I'm going to tell you that. It's very sweet. But on the outside of this, it's about Chloe finding out that what people seem on the outside isn't always what's going on in the inside. And it's a big discovery book about humans in general, not about people with special needs, but how everybody is individual inside anyways. And it's a great book for topics like autism, LGBTQ, feminism, and mental health. So if you're looking for something different, that's a very sweet story. You'll like this.
My last book is The Beantown Girls by Jane Haley, who is the author of the Saturday Evening Girls Club. And she's also coming to the main library here April 10th to talk about her books. It's about 3 girls that go into the Red Cross during World War II. 3 friends from Boston, and they make donuts and serve coffee to the troops. And it follows them through Europe. It's a good story.
Okay, so my last book is Dolores Claiborne by Stephen King. I mean, I started reading Stephen King with Christine, and I really loved it. And then I read a few more books, and suddenly they just started getting too gruesome and too horrible. So I was delighted when I found Dolores Claiborne, because I enjoy reading Stephen King, and this kind of didn't have any of those kind of gruesome aspects or whatever. So Dolores, it takes place in a small island in Maine. So Dolores Claiborne worked for a very wealthy owner called Vera. She started off as a maid and then became housekeeper. And after Vera had a number of strokes, she finally became her full-time live-in housekeeper. And Dolores was quite happy to be living there because her life with her husband really wasn't very good. He was very abusive, both physically and verbally. And one last time after he beat her, she said, "If you ever do that again, I'm going to leave you." And shortly after this, their daughter seemed to be kind of withdrawn and moody, and Dolores thought that she was just having a boyfriend problem. But she found out afterwards that her husband, Joe St. George, had actually abused their daughter. And this time she said to him, and she was in earnest, "If you ever touch our daughter again, I really will kill you." And after this, she decided that really she should leave him. So she went to the bank to get some money out to leave, to discover that he had taken all of the money out of the account. And at that point, she decided that she was going to kill him. And she kind of let it slip to Vera how things were, and that she had this idea. And Vera, made it be known that this wasn't kind of an unusual situation for her. And she said that maybe her husband's car accident wasn't an accident after all, and that maybe sometimes these accidents are for the best. And the story actually takes the form of Vera's confession to the police. She confesses to the murder of her husband, Joe St. George, because after Vera dies, Dolores is suspected of murdering her to get the money. And when Dolores, suffered from dementia, she'd get scared, and she thought there were people were after her, and she'd call these dust bunnies. And one time she fell down the stairs, and she was in really bad pain, and she begged Dolores to help her to end it all. So Dolores went to get a rolling pen, and when she came back, Vera was actually dead. And in her confession to the police, in order to try and make them believe that she didn't kill Vera, she tells them how she did actually kill her husband. And she goes back to the house and she buys this expensive bottle of scotch, and she gets Joe drunk, and then she entices him out into the garden and tries to get him to hit her. And when Joe is coming after her, she makes him walk over these brambles, and there's wooden boards that are rotten, and he falls down into the well. After he falls into the well, he doesn't actually die. So Dolores keeps hitting him until he does die. So by confessing all this to the police, again, she's hoping that they won't think that she has killed Vera. but after Vera dies, it transpires that Vera had left her all her money, and it makes it look even more as if she had killed her. So again, to persuade everybody that she didn't, she leaves all the money to a cat and dog's home, and eventually she is cleared of Vera's murder, and she's reunited with her daughter.
So my last book is very light, actually. So, because I think sometimes in between these, you need to have like a palate cleanser. Like you do one and then so mine, one of my go-to authors for that is Ellen Hildebrand. So her books are really, really light. They're set in Nantucket, which is a great place to be, of course. And it can make you feel good about also what's going on in the world, I think, because these people have a lot of money, they go to great restaurants, their life seems great, they're beautiful, that blonde girl in your story. But then they do things like they make the craziest decisions, and you know that it's going to go badly. Why are they making these choices? But then you feel good about your life and the news. You know this disaster's going on. So I think that she's a nice author to like in between these other books. Cleanse the palate. This one's Rumor. The Rumor.
My last book is A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. This one is not light.
No, it's heavy.
This is a big brick, but it's totally worth it. This is the best book I read last year. One of the best books I've ever read. I can't recommend it enough, but it's a big old book. It's about 4 men who become friends in college, and it follows them from that age through their 50s, this like friendship between them. And it's usually these books are about women and friendships between women, so it's kind of different in that it's about men. But it's these 4 guys, JB, Malcolm, Willem, and Jude is really the center of it. He's an orphan. He comes from this like terrible background with these horrific stories of abuse that kind of unfold slowly throughout the book. And it's really about how you can make your own family with your friends sometime, and just decades and decades of it. It's really, some of it's really awful if you have any sort of like triggers. Some of it can be really hard to read, but as much as it's awful, there are equal parts where it's just so moving and beautiful, and I can't recommend it enough, but it's great.
Well, thank you all for coming. There are copies of books for checkout. There's a couple that are on the hold. You'll have to put a request on because you can't get them. Somebody holds on them. But there are some audios, large print and regular print. There's some information back there of upcoming program and water. And thank you for coming.
Thank you.